It does. There's something really juicy in that. And I had a conversation with somebody else earlier too, and we were talking about how um like all of the practices that we develop, whether it is the ceremony, the ritual, the mindfulness, whatever, and we're going to talk about those in this program. That's part of the purpose of this program. Um, we can approach them in different ways. Like we can approach them as a discipline, like we have to do this. This is how it has to be done, and try to get good at it. And but that's, I mean, that's almost like it's almost like a capitalist way of approaching them, like I have to attain these things and I have to get good at them or something. But if the practices really change us and evolve us, and we have a relationship with them instead of seeing them as a transactional, like you say, I'm not just doing this practice, I'm being in this practice. I'm in relationship with this practice because the practice evolves me. Like, I love that reframing that you're offering that so can you talk a bit more about that? Like, what is ceremony to you? What's the purpose? I know I've been in many ceremonies with you, and I know like you have a lot of relationship with, the natural world, and that's really embedded in your practice. Can you talk about those practices and how they have evolved you into a being person?
Um, of course, those practices, and when you're first learning the elements and the whole practice of certain ceremonies, and there are many, there are 500 nations of people in the native world, and we all have some of us have similar languages and similar ceremonies, but there's little tiny nuances. For instance, if the way I was taught to do sweat lodge is a little bit different than the Lakota way, which I was taught later. But in the learning of those, like you don't walk in front of the altar and you go around clockwise and you make an offering to the fire. I mean, those are little tiny tidbits of the ceremony that are pretty vital and important to many of the elders who hand that way down, because it is traditionally gifted, handed down to the generations. But when you're 10 and 12 years old, 18 and 19, and you're learning these ceremonies, you don't really understand the why of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the why of it becomes the being. You see, the why of it, the understanding of, you honor the cedar, you honor the tree, you honor the life force in what's around you in the nature. You honor every element. The water is such a vital, important part of all ceremony, as is fire, those two things. And the way you honor those things, they're in the teaching part, they're in the doing part. And a lot of people do those things in a certain way, and they don't get to the being part. They don't get to the feeling of it. And then it becomes an egotistical, well, I've heard people in ceremony say, you're not going to do it that way, are you? It becomes, they're the boss and they know better than you do about that ceremony. It becomes an egotistical thing.
Yeah.
And I'm nowhere near beyond my ego. I don't want anybody to hear that, because I still definitely fight that almost every day. And not really a fight anymore. It's more like, okay, it's got to be my friend now, this ego that lives inside me. You got to help me move beyond that. And the being part is a life. It's living. It's every day remembering and reminding myself, oh, there's a cat out in my yard. I need to be kind to that critter that's in my yard. I want to pass along some kindness. There's a tree that's blowing in the wind, and what's the message in that tree? And how can I get close to that? I think trees are my favorite teachers, because they stay in one place their whole life. Mm-hmm. They don't get to walk around. They don't get to go to other countries. They stay right where they're planted for their whole life, unless somebody comes along, digs them up, and moves them. but they're perfectly comfortable with that. And they're listening always. They're listening not just to humanity, the people or the animals, but they're listening to the wind and the sky. And if you can, for myself, it's about getting really close to that tree and loving that tree. I have one right out this window next to me that's a huge cypress. And oh my gosh, it's so beautiful.
Mm.
And I talk to it. It talks to me. It's moving now in the wind, because I love that tree.
Yeah.
And it knows that. So the connection I have with that tree, there's reminders. And then the birds that go in the tree. And then there's those reminders of that's living, to be in a life where you're in the nature and you're so connected. That's really a joyful, and joy is an inside job. So the tree brings me that joy because it's always there. It never runs away. And if I need to cry or I need to talk to somebody, there's my tree. I'll just go outside and get a big hug and be there. So that's the living, the being part that I'm talking about. But the doing, the practice, like you called it a practice, I call it my practice. My daily practice requires that I sit still, that I pay attention, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So the practice part, the doing part is a very necessary, and every individual person has to develop and create their own practice. For example, if they're going to smudge or use a feather or play the drum or take a walk in the woods or whatever that spiritual practice. I know you, Heather, for an example, I love seeing those pictures of you when you've got the snow in your face and on your eyebrows, and you've got this mask on kind of thing, and you're taking your walk in the snow. That's part of your spiritual practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love that about you. So that's in the doing, and it's a very, very necessary piece.
Yeah.
And when you can feel it inside of you so deeply, that's in the being and living by that feeling.